Order, order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order.
Mr. Speaker, I've not seen the proposal, but I'd certainly welcome a debate on nuclear energy from those who sit opposite as part of our future energy mix, and it should include also a debate on how that all fits together in terms of the extra money that we're already putting into low-emission coal, low-emission gas.
Order. The Minister has a call.
Mr. Speaker, I'll continue.
The Minister resume his seat. The member, order. They haven't called the member yet. Member's on my right. The member for Lily on point of order.
It was a very specific question. What discussions has the Minister had?
Order. I remind the member for Lily, if he wants to take a point of order, he should be quite clear on what the point is. He will not debate it. I call the Minister. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd welcome a debate. In fact, I'd also welcome for the Leader of the Opposition to copy this government, the Howard government's uranium policy, and also have the premiers of each state copy our uranium policy, because until we can actually mine the uranium in each state, we can't export it. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have here a media statement that was just passed to me. The Australian community and the media statement is from the company Australian Nuclear Energy Proprietary Limited, and the statement says the Australian community will ultimately decide the best way to provide sustainable energy for our country, and I would hope that that would be through a debate. I know the Leader of the Opposition likes debates.
Order.
Mr. Speaker, the press release, the media statement goes on and says the Australian Nuclear Energy Proprietary Limited is a private company established to examine potential commercial responses to future energy needs. A&E Company Secretary Mr. Bruce Fitzgerald says that contrary to today's media reports, the company has not put forward a proposal to build nuclear power plants in Australia. The company will make no further comment.
I see. So you've had discussions, but it's to have no further comment.
Order. The honourable member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Would the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is assisting parents with the education of their children?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Blair, and in answering that question, can I say that the federal government is assisting the parents of Australia to educate their children in a number of ways, based on a number of principles. The first and most important principle is freedom of parental choice. I make it plain, Mr. Speaker, that it's a cornerstone of our education policy that parents have a right to choose, an unfettered right to choose the type of education they regard as suitable for their children. I make that observation, Mr. Speaker, in the wake of the release of some ABS schools statistics which shows a continued drift of children from government to non-government schools, and we now have 1.1 million, or one-third of all students, are now attending non-government schools in Australia. Now, that is not something, Mr. Speaker, that I necessarily welcome, because as well as believing very strongly in freedom of choice, I believe very strongly that the basis of a good education system in this country is a vibrant, strong, well-based, well-resourced public education system. And if parents are to have genuine freedom of choice, then the offerings of a strong public system have to constitute a very important part of that choice. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, in the wake of the release of these statistics, we've had, regrettably, the usual responses from state education ministers and leaders of the teacher unions. The Victorian Education Minister, John Lenders, said that the figures reflected the Howard government's funding priorities, Mr. Speaker, implying that in some way our funding had shortchanged parents who send their kids to government schools and favoured those who send their children to non-government schools. he neglects to acknowledge that in the almost 11 years that we have been in power, direct federal government funding for government schools has risen by 118%, while the enrolments in government schools over that same period have increased by only 1.2%. It remains the case, Mr Speaker, as if you make allowance for that share of general revenue payments by the Commonwealth to the states that is used by the states to fund public education, which you must do if there is to be any fair statistical comparison, you find that government schools, which now enrol 67% of students, receive 75% of all government funding, while non-government schools that enrol 33% of students receive 25% of funding. Now, they are unarguable statistics, and they are contributed to by the Commonwealth's direct payments that have gone up 118%, and also the payments through the GST, which figures revealed today have the states in the current financial year $2 billion better off than they would have been under the old financial sharing arrangements, Mr Speaker. So, and it's echoed again by Mary Blewett of the Australian Education Union's Victorian branch, said it goes on to attack the federal government for allegedly, and it's a false accusation, shortchanging government schools. The reality is that under the Schools Assistance Act, the more that states increase their payments to government schools, the more the Commonwealth's payments go up, because the two are linked through a formula written into the Act. So, Mr Speaker, those who are concerned that too many parents are taking their children out of government schools, and I understand those concerns because I do not want to see, and the government does not want to see, the government system weakened. But can I say to state education ministers, can I say to the leaders of the teacher unions, instead of falsely blaming the federal government, why don't you ask the parents why they've made a different choice? And if you ask parents, they don't say it's because the federal government doesn't give enough money. Parents talk about standards, they talk about discipline, they talk about values, they talk about a whole range of things, Mr Speaker. Now, I think the parents are the people who should be listened to, because in the end, we exist as governments to serve the choices of parents. We don't exist as governments to serve particular ideologies, and we don't exist to serve a preference for the private over the state or the state over the private. One of the great pieces of genius of the Australian achievement, Mr Speaker, is that we've always been able to achieve a sense of balance between public and private provision. What I want in education is an Australia where parents have that unfettered choice, and I think people who worry about the drift between government and private schools, instead of falsely blaming the federal government, they should talk to the parents and find out why they have exercised their choice in a particular direction.
Order. I inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon members of a parliamentary delegation from the European Parliament. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to our visitors. The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Minister for Industry. Has the Minister had discussions with any representative of Australian Nuclear Energy Limited or not?
The Honourable the Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources. Order. Order. The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I say that I would welcome a discussion from this company, and I would like to see Australia have a debate on nuclear energy and where it fits into our future energy mix. And of course, any proponent of a nuclear power station in Australia would need bipartisan support from both sides of this House before they would invest their money in a power station. So I would like to have the meeting and I would like to have the debate.
The Honourable Member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Treasurer. Would the Treasurer inform the House of recent data on the Australian economy? What does this indicate about the government's economic management?
The Honourable the Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Stirling for his question, and I can inform the House that the Census Business Index for Small and Medium Enterprises was released today, and this is the most comprehensive survey of small and medium-sized business in Australia. There are 1.96 million trading businesses in Australia, and 95% of them are small businesses. Mr Speaker, the survey today showed that confidence has risen in the small and medium enterprise sector by 6 percentage points to a net balance of 56%. And expectations about the economy rose strongly, with a net 13% of SMEs believing the economy would be better in a year's time. This is the first positive result since May of 2006 and the highest result in 2 years. The report also asks whether the small and medium enterprise sector has a net favourability for particular levels of government. And, Mr Speaker, I can inform the House that the government in Australia, which is the most supported government by small and medium enterprises, is the federal government, Mr Speaker, and the assessment of federal government policies rose to a net balance of positive 11%. Now, Mr Speaker, lest someone thinks, well, that's not much, the least supported government in Australia by small and medium enterprises was the New South Wales government, which had a net favourability of minus 34%, Mr Speaker. This is the 12th successive quarter the New South Wales government has recorded the lowest result of any state and territory. And the key reason why small and medium enterprises don't support the New South Wales government, they name it as having too much bureaucracy and too high taxes, Mr Speaker. So I noticed in the paper this morning that the Treasurer of New South Wales, Mr Costa, says that he's being persecuted because of his ethnic background. Can I suggest to Mr Costa, it is not his parents, it's his policies that are the problem in New South Wales. Where you have a state which has trailed the rest of Australia, where you have a state which has high bureaucracy and high taxes, it is no excuse to say that there's some kind of ethnic component in the favourability rating of the New South Wales government. The New South Wales government stands at minus 34%. If it wants to win back the confidence of small and medium enterprises, it ought to do something about its bureaucracy, something about its taxes, support improved industrial relations and take a leap out of coalition policy.
I inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon members of a parliamentary delegation from the Republic of Poland, led by Mr Bogdan Borusewicz, Speaker of the Senate of the Republic of Poland. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to our visitors. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Industry Minister. I refer the to the Minister's answer to my last question, where he said he would welcome discussions with Australian Nuclear Energy Limited. My question to the Minister is, has the Minister already had discussions with Australian Nuclear Energy Limited?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Well, Mr Speaker, I know the member for Hunter is a supporter of nuclear energy because he said it on the radio.
Order. Order. The member for Fowler.
Mr Speaker, we are always happy to see a proposal of any type in my office, and I have not seen the proposal from this company put before me in my office. Now, Mr Speaker,
the member for Jagga.
We need to have the debate.
Order.
There needs to be a bipartisan position. One thing I don't understand is why the Labor Party, or some parts of the Labor Party, it's a shame the member for Batman's not here, but doesn't make sense to me that some parts of the Labor Party say we can export uranium to our friends and they can use it to lower greenhouse gas emissions by using it in baseload nuclear power stations, but they don't want to have a debate here in Australia about nuclear energy.
The honourable member for Riverina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The member for Riverina has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Transport and Regional Services. Would the Deputy Prime Minister advise the House how the government's $10 billion National Water Plan will protect investment in regional jobs in my electorate of Riverina and in rural areas generally? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any proposals that might undermine investment in our regional economies?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Riverina for her question and her great interest in the issues surrounding water security and the sustainability of regional economies in those areas that rely on water security. And we certainly understand, Mr. Speaker, that water security, particularly throughout the Murray-Darling Basin, underpins regional development prospects in all those communities throughout that region. Mr. Speaker, the member for Riverina asked about our $10 billion National Water Plan, and of course it needs to be said at the outset, Mr. Speaker, that this would not be possible. It would not be possible for our government to be putting this proposal forward, to be encouraging the states to commit with the Commonwealth on this investment and on this nation-building scheme if it hadn't have been for the good economic management of the economy over the last 11 years to put us in a position where we can afford to invest this money. 11 years ago, the nation would never have been able to afford to invest this amount of money in what is a critical national issue. And now we have the Labor Party wanting to sort of put their hand up and say, me too, after opposing every inch of the way the hard work the nation's put in to achieve this economic outcome so that we can afford these investments in much-needed infrastructure. And so we have the Labor spokesman going out and saying, we'll do this and we'll do that. We've had the member for Grayndler actually promising to free money for state projects. Mr. Speaker, we know that that's what this Labor Party is all about, is being beholden to state governments. Mr. Speaker, we also know that they want to punish farmers and regional communities for the mistakes of state governments in the over-allocation of water rights. Mr. Speaker, well, we will not punish farmers nor regional communities for the mistakes that state governments have made, and we make no apology for that. And that's why we put this package together, so we can sensibly approach an issue that we need to address. So where it exists, Mr. Speaker, over-allocation will be addressed firstly through efficiency savings in the system. That's why we've indicated we're prepared to invest $6 billion into efficiency savings so that we can address that over-allocation issue. And secondly, as a last resort, we are prepared to purchase water rights in the marketplace from willing sellers. But we want to generate the efficiency savings first because we believe that there is a significant amount of water that can be saved in that regard. And, Mr. Speaker, we will engage all stakeholders to provide us with advice and guidance from top to bottom on this issue and every step of the way. We want to engage in a genuine partnership with those regional communities to enhance and ensure the prosperity of those regional communities, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin area. Now, Labor's alternative, and the member for Grayndler outlined this in a speech yesterday, is to blame the farmers for over-allocation. To blame the farmers for over-allocation. Not put the finger on the state governments. Not put the finger on the state governments who made the over-allocation. He's out there saying he's going to free up money and give to the state governments. Where's he going to get the money from? He's going to get the money from the good management of this government that you opposed, that he opposed every inch of the way. So he didn't want us to make the savings. He didn't want us to improve the economic circumstances in Australia. But now that it's been done, he wants to grab the money and go and spend it, Mr. Speaker. So the member for Grayndler should get out into the countryside and talk to a few of the producers around the place. The member for Grayndler says that on the one hand the price of water should be higher, but he won't say how high. He wants to tell farmers what crops they want to grow. He wants to tell farmers what crops they should be. What crops they should be growing. Can I just tell the member for Grayndler that the market should set the price of water. The market should determine what crops farmers grow, not some central committee of the ALP Politburo, Mr Speaker. So he says that the Murray needs a drink, but he doesn't acknowledge that there's a drought on. One of his comments he made in this speech, he said, Labor firmly believes that the over-allocation of water licences is a primary source of the water crisis. Well, the primary source of the water crisis, there's a drought on. There's a drought on at the moment. I don't know whether you've noticed, but there's a drought on. And we want to responsibly address better managing water resources for a sustainable future. It's quite clear, Mr Speaker, as we travel around regional Australia, that working families in regional Australia, they know the Labor Party's form on forestry, the decisions they took at the last election at the last moment. They know their form on coal mining, their attitude towards coal mining versus climate change. We know their form on uranium mining and the deployment of uranium, and that the regional communities do not trust Labor on the management of water in the future, Mr Speaker. Labor tries to be all things to all people. They've spent 11 years opposing the government's measures to improve the economy, and now they want to get their hands on the loot and spend the benefits of that hard work. Well, no amount of gloss on top of this new team in the Labor Party is going to hide the rust that we know exists underneath, where they're anti-jobs, anti-development and anti-regional Australia.
I inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon Mr Helge Sander, Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation of the Kingdom of Denmark. On behalf of the House, I extend to him a very warm welcome. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Industry Minister. When did the Minister meet with Australian Nuclear Energy Limited? And given the Minister has now been asked this question 4 times and has refused to answer, what does the Minister have to hide about the government's nuclear reactor plans for Australia?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Mr Speaker, we have absolutely nothing to hide about our nuclear policy.
Order! Order! Order!
Mr Speaker,
order. The Minister has the
can
call.
I just explain to those who sit opposite that, because I know they don't understand business and business principles, but I'm the business portfolio, and people come and see me all the time and talk to me about a whole range of issues, and my constituents come and talk to me and talk about the whole range of issues. And I do not disclose my diary usually. But today, I will say that this morning, my PA, Colleen Robertson, did a search of my diary for Australian Nuclear Energy Proprietary Limited to see if they'd met with me, and the search revealed nothing.
Order! The Minister's in his seat. The member for Oxley will remove himself under Standing Order 94A. The Minister has been asked a serious question. He will be given the courtesy of being heard when he gives his answer. I call the Minister.
Mr Speaker, can I also say that I don't recall discussing this proposal with these 3 gentlemen. And, and if someone is able to remind me of when I did, I will correct the record.
The Honourable Member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Is the Minister aware of calls to reduce Australia's commitment to the war on terror, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Member for Thank you, Mr Speaker. I appreciate the honourable member's question. And, Mr Speaker, this government has been determined that Australia should play its part in the war against terrorism. And I think all of us felt very deeply about the Australians who were killed in Bali and in other incidents, and That just reinforced our determination to strike back at terrorists and to defeat terrorists. Mr Speaker, one of the areas where we make a contribution is in Afghanistan. It's still a very dangerous, particularly southern Afghanistan, is still a very dangerous environment, and we expect there to be, to use a phrase, a spring offensive from the Taliban in the first few months of this year. I welcome the decision by the British government, Mr Speaker, that they will deploy 1,400 more troops to Afghanistan, bringing their total in Afghanistan to 7,700. And I'm proud of the contribution the 550 Australians are making in Afghanistan. And can I just say that, we've said this before, the government's sending or has sent a scoping team to Afghanistan to inform our defence planning on possible changes and possible increases to our force structure in Afghanistan, because we are committed to helping the Afghan people, as we are the Iraqi people, to free themselves of the scourge of terrorism. Mr Speaker, I noticed on the 22nd of February that the Leader of the Opposition supported an increase in Australian troops to Afghanistan. This is what he said: "We've always taken a constructive bipartisan approach to the war against Osama bin Laden and the Taliban." Apparently not al-Qaeda in Iraq, but in any case, if they're in Afghanistan, he's against them. Mr Speaker, this was an interesting statement by the Leader of the Opposition. He supports more troops being sent to Afghanistan, but 6 days earlier, in an interview on Channel 7, he said that we should be withdrawing our troops from Iraq because they are needed back here in our region. This is what he said: "We have other alliance responsibilities in our own region. You've got the Solomons, you've got the problems in Tonga, you've got problems in Fiji. Who knows what's going to happen in parts of New Guinea? We have limited military resources." Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition yet again is trying to have it both ways. How can a member of the House of Representatives argue on the one hand we should bring troops back because we need them in our own region, but he supports sending more troops to Afghanistan, Mr Speaker? You don't have to be a Philadelphia lawyer to work out that there is a stark and embarrassing contradiction, Mr Speaker.
The member for Melbourne Ports.
This, of course, is what we have been treated to for the last 2 months from the Leader of the Opposition. What, of course, we who followed the foreign affairs debate through the last 5 years were treated to, that he supports every imaginable position. Troops out of Iraq because we need more troops in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but more troops can go to Afghanistan, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, even the Labor Party can work out that there is a contradiction there. And there's one final contradiction, which is a pretty fundamental one, Mr Speaker. Why is it that it is so important to fight terrorism in Afghanistan, but it doesn't matter what happens in Iraq? It doesn't matter that the terrorists have a great victory in Iraq, but it does in Afghanistan. Mr Speaker, if you ask me, that is a pretty silly sort of position.
The Chief
and
Opposition
it is a position not driven by strength of policy or conviction, not driven by belief, not driven by a desire to do the right thing by our country, our allies and our friends around the world. It is driven by grubby politics.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Industry Minister, and it follows our 4 previous questions. I refer also to the Minister's answer to the previous question, where he said that his PA did a search of his diary and could not find any entry of a meeting with Australian Nuclear Energy, and further that he could not recall a meeting with the 3 individuals referred to, presumably in today's paper. Minister, the question is, have you had any discussions with any individual from Australian Nuclear Energy Limited?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Representing Australian Nuclear Energy Limited, no.
He came into Fairfax and changed their act, did he?
Order. Members are holding up their own question time. The honourable member for Dobell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Treasurer. Would the Treasurer outline to the House the latest information on superannuation funds under management in Australia and what this means for national savings?
The Honourable the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Dobell for his question. Today, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released data on managed funds, which showed in the December quarter of 2006 total consolidated assets of managed funds increased 4.6% and grew to nearly $1.1 trillion. So, Mr Speaker, let me say that again. The amount of managed funds in Australia as at the end of December 2006 is now about $1.1 trillion. Mr Speaker,
the member for Hotham and the Attorney General. They want to have a conversation, they could go outside.
Mr Speaker, that's managed funds. That does not include self-managed superannuation, which is about 23% of superannuation, and managed funds does not include only superannuation. It includes other funds that are under management. Mr Speaker, if you were to bring in self-managed funds for superannuation, of course the savings would be greater than $1.1 trillion. Mr Speaker, the measure of savings in Australia's national accounts has been negative for several quarters, but, Mr Speaker, that measure does not capture the accumulation of assets. This is a point that's been made by Rick Battolino, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, who said in a speech in August of 2006, "Conventional measures of saving do not take into account capital gains. This has a particular bearing on Australian households because, as noted, they now hold a high proportion of their financial assets in investments such as shares and superannuation, on which a significant part of the return is in the form of capital gains. We showed, once allowance is made for capital gains, the saving rate of Australian households is neither low nor falling." In fact, Mr Speaker, it's estimated by the Reserve Bank of Australia that, looking at household net financial wealth, savings are around 24% of disposable income. This measure suggests that Australia's savings by global standards are actually quite high. This is an important point, Mr Speaker, which has perhaps been overlooked in a lot of the economic commentary up to date, that when you do a household savings ratio and you are looking just at income, you are not allowing for the fact that many Australian households are actually making quite a rational decision to put their savings into better yielding returns, either in the stock market or in superannuation. In many European countries, you might put your money into a bank which then invests, and that is counted in the conventional measure of saving because it's held in a bank. But many Australians have taken quite a rational decision to invest either directly into the share market or to invest through self-managed funds. Mr Speaker, I have no doubt that the volume of money that Australians now have in managed funds and directly in the stock market has contributed greatly to the increase in stock market values. It was estimated at the beginning of this year that the complete market capitalisation of the Australian Stock Exchange was around $1.4 trillion. When you think that managed funds has $1.1 trillion, and there is, in addition to that, considerable self-managed superannuation, you can see there is enormous stock of savings in the Australian economy, which is now looking for a home to invest. And no doubt, Mr Speaker, on cue comes one of the genii of the Labor backbench, who, Mr Speaker, if he listened as much as he talked, Mr Speaker, would have heard me say that managed funds do not include just superannuation. Managed funds include listed property trusts. They include cash management trusts. And I suppose Paul Keating invented the cash management trust, did he? Did he invent the listed
the member for
property
Blackstone
trust?
will not debate the question.
I suppose, Mr Speaker, he invented the self-managed superannuation funds. Let me guess, Paul Keating invented the internet.
Now, that was Al Gore.
Sorry, that was Al Gore, Mr Speaker. Paul Keating got an Oscar yesterday, did he? No, Mr Speaker. Some of these people are so out of touch. They haven't seen a good economic policy in so long, they wouldn't know how to recognise one when it came here, Mr Speaker. That's why you can't trust the Labor Party, caught fossilised in a period of time of ignorance, Mr Speaker, until the light of the coalition came and shone on them. And, Mr Speaker, it's going to stay there for a long period of time.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Industry Minister. I refer to the Minister's answer to my previous question, where he said he had not had a meeting with any representative of Australian Nuclear Energy Limited. Has the Minister had discussions with any individual with an interest in Australian Nuclear Energy Limited, including Mr Ron Walker, the former Treasurer of the Liberal Party? Minister, what is the Minister got to hide?
Order. Members on my right. The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Stop pretending to read.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I say it would be very odd for the Minister for Resources not to talk to three prominent people in the investment and resource industry in Australia. Can I just say again, as I thought I'd already said, but perhaps I've got to make it crystal clear, I have not met with the company. I have not met with representatives of the company about this issue, and I have not seen a proposal on a nuclear power station from them.
Order. 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 The Leader of the House. The Honourable Member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. How is Australia supporting progress in the North Korean six-party talks, and what lessons can be learned from achievements to date?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Well, Mr Speaker, first can I thank the Honourable Member for Boothby for his question and, of course, the great interest he has in these issues. And, Mr Speaker, I've said before that we in the Australian government welcome the 13th of February agreement, which gives a timetable for the dismantling of North Korea's nuclear program. I also would like to take the opportunity, Mr Speaker, of welcoming the announcement that the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammed El-Baradei, intends to visit Pyongyang in the next week or so, the week commencing the 12th of March, I think it is actually, and this visit is at the invitation of the North Korean government. So this is a good sign that the North Korean government is moving towards the implementation of the agreement that was announced on the 13th of February. As the House knows, we've worked very closely with the American administration, but also with the Chinese and with the South Koreans and Japanese in relation to the whole issue of North Korea's nuclear tests and its nuclear program. And the agreement that has been reached provides for international assistance to North Korea in return for specific progress towards abandoning its nuclear weapons. With that all in mind, Mr Speaker, I have decided to send an Australian delegation to Pyongyang almost certainly in the week beginning the 5th of March. This will be led by a very senior official in my department and include a number of officials, and they will urge North Korea, first of all, to fulfil its obligations under the agreement that has been reached and, in particular, to dismantle permanently its nuclear programs. And the delegation will indicate that such actions will allow Australia and many other countries in the broader international community to provide the assistance to North Korea that the people, the ordinary people of North Korea, so desperately need. It will also be an opportunity to lay down some markers for the strengthening of a bilateral relationship between Australia and North Korea. The delegation will be able also to check the progress of multilateral aid projects to which we currently contribute. They are basically projects that are associated with food. So, Mr Speaker, I think the delegation should make a useful contribution, particularly bearing in mind the close alliance relationship between Australia and the United States. The delegation will be able to make a useful contribution to sending some messages to the North Korean regime about their obligations and what the broader international community, not just the other 5 parties in the 6-party talks, expect of them, and what benefits North Korea can get out of fulfilling their obligations under the agreement that was announced on the 13th of February.
The honourable member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's statement on the 29th of December 2006 that he would have no objection to a nuclear reactor being located in Bennelong. Does the Prime Minister support the statement by the members for Menzies, Flinders, Gilmore and Curtin, as well as the New South Wales opposition leader Peter Dednam, who have indicated their opposition to having one of the 25 reactors in their seats? Will the Prime Minister rule out a nuclear power reactor in Bennelong?
Order. The honourable order. Order. The honourable Prime Minister. Order. The member for Blair.
Mr Speaker, I haven't seen the statement attributed to my colleagues, but I'm sure that, as is their custom, Mr Speaker, they make very sensible statements. My position on nuclear power is that I think this country should examine the nuclear option. It is too early to be talking about individual locations because...
Order.
Well, Mr Speaker...
Order. Order.
Mr Speaker,
Order.
I know the game that the opposition is playing. I may think it is clever short-term politics.
Order. The member for Fowler.
But it is doing a great deal of long-term damage to a sensible debate in this country. I welcome the fact that 3 prominent Australian businessmen have formed a company to look at the issue of nuclear power generation. And I would think it completely unexceptionable that they might have had some contact with the government, Mr Speaker. So let me make, I listen with fascination to all of the questions asked by the leader of the opposition, Mr Speaker. I mean,
the deputy leader of the opposition
turns on somebody who, according to the Premier of South Australia, is a good enough advisor on the business affairs of South Australia to sit at the cabinet table with the Labor Premier, Mr Walker, who was, I'm very happy to say, honorary federal treasurer of the Liberal Party, and a very good one, Mr Speaker. He's now the chairman of John Fairfax Limited, and Robert Champion de Crepney, who, amongst other things, as well as being a very successful businessman, was also a member some years ago of the Council for Reconciliation, and devoted a great deal of time to improving relations between the Indigenous population and the rest of the Australian population. But I would just say to the member for Parramatta, I think this nation, if it is serious about climate change, has to look at the nuclear option. I'm not frightened of that. I'm not ruling out power stations anywhere in this country. That is a juvenile, idiotic game to play, Mr Speaker. If you are interested, Mr Speaker, if you are interested in a serious debate, you will embrace it.
The member for Jagga is warned.
I do not intend to be diverted from a rational discussion of the nuclear option by this kind of childish scare tactic.
Poor old Peter Dedman, he was travelling badly before that. What have you done to him?
The honourable member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. Would the Minister update the House on the impact of the government's workplace relation reforms on the Australian economy? Is the Minister aware of any threats to these reforms?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations.
This will be good.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Latrobe for his question. He's a great member for Latrobe. Great member. In 1996, the unemployment rate in his electorate was 6.2%. Today it is 3.5%. 3.5%. And, Mr Speaker, I can update the House on the impact of the government's changes to the Labor Party's job-destroying unfair dismissal laws. And I look at the Census report, which the Treasurer referred to a little bit earlier, that came out today.
Order.
It's a good report, Mr Speaker, the report notes that already some 10% of small and medium enterprises reported that they have made changes, with putting new workplace agreements into place being the most common action to date. SMEs in the Northern Territory were the most likely to have made changes so far. In the Northern Territory, Snowy, pay attention. Mr Speaker, the Northern Territory member for Solomon, the member for Solomon over there, Mr Speaker, the member for Solomon, in February of last year, in the month before the introduction of work choices, the unemployment rate in the Northern Territory was 6.4%. Today it is 2%. 2%. So, Mr Speaker, there is no doubt. There is no doubt.
Order.
If you add together the Census survey together with the outcomes as measured in the unemployment rate, that there is a positive impact associated with the removal of the unfair dismissal laws on small business. So it begs the question, why does the Labor Party want to reintroduce the job-destroying unfair dismissal laws? Why?
Order. Members on my right.
Mr Speaker, it could only be that the Rudd-Gillard-Combe combo is going to deliver a platform for the trade union movement to re-enter every workplace.
The Minister resume his seat. The Honourable Chief Opposition Whip on a point of order.
I'd ask that you enforce Standing Order 64.
I've been listening carefully to the Minister, and yes, I believe he could refer to members by their title or by their seat. I call the Minister.
Mr Speaker, the net impact of the Labor Party's job-destroying unfair dismissal laws is that it does cost jobs. Various surveys previously talked about in this place have said it could have an impact up to 77,000 jobs out there in the community. The evidence now clearly illustrates that small business has embraced our work choices changes. Small business has said, yes, we will take the risk in employing people. And, Mr Speaker, when the OECD came out and said only a couple of weeks ago that the unfair dismissal laws set up disadvantaged those most vulnerable, particularly women and young people. They were the most disadvantaged by prescriptive labour laws because it made the risk of employing those people far greater for small business. So why does the Labor Party want to reintroduce these laws? Only because of this pact they have with the trade union movement to let the trade unions back into every workplace, into every small business. The trade unions will run the Labor Party if, on a dark day, they get into government. And, Mr Speaker, that's not just bad for jobs, that's bad for the Australian economy.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the government, through the Industry Minister, having secret discussions
Order. Members on my right.
about building nuclear reactors while the government continues to refuse to increase Australia's mandatory renewable energy target?
Order.
Will the Prime Minister...
The members on my right. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has clearly misrepresented what the Industry Minister has said, and he should not be allowed to assert by way of a question what he knows to be false.
Leader of the House, resume his seat. Order. I am listening carefully to the Leader of the Opposition. He has started to ask his question. I will allow him to complete his question. Order. The Leader of the House.
He has claimed in his question that the Industry Minister has been having talks. The Industry Minister has denied that.
Resume his seat. The Leader of the House, resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition has not completed his question. I'll listen to his question. I'll ask him to begin his question again. Order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. questions to the Prime Minister. Why is the government having secret discussions through the Industry Minister about building nuclear reactors while the government continues to refuse to increase Australia's mandatory renewable energy target? Will the Prime Minister support energy renewables rather than nuclear reactors?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. The government is not having any secret discussions, Mr. Speaker, and there was nothing in what the minister said to indicate that. But let me make it very clear, Mr. Speaker.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Talking for myself, Mr. Speaker, the only contact I've had with these three very reputable Australian businessmen is that in about the middle of last year, Mr. Walker, on a telephone conversation I had with him, and I, from time to time, yes, very conspiratorial. I mean, I've only known Mr. Walker for about 20 years, Mr. Speaker, and he's only been, you know, a good fundraiser and a great contributor to our side of politics. So it's really, I mean, this, Mr. Speaker, this is the new politics, Mr. Speaker. This is the new above the ruck, new standard politics. There's something conspiratorial in John Howard talking to Ron Walker. You have got to be kidding. Anyway, I mean, heavens above, I saw the Leader of the Opposition with Ron Walker at the soccer.
Order.
I wonder what they were talking
Members
about,
on my right.
Yeah, what's
the Minister for Employment.
And I tell you what, hey,
Order.
That's only the half of it. Steve Bracks was there too. Really? Look, I had a discussion with Ron Walker. I'm very happy to tell the world that one Saturday morning when Ron rings me, it's not with racing tips. Neither of us are very interested in racing, but it's about something else. And Ron, he said to me, what about the middle of last year, he said that he and Hugh Morgan and Robert de Crepney had decided to register a company that could be interested in nuclear power. And I said, well, that's a great idea, Ron, because you know my view on it. I don't know what this is all about. My view and the view of the government about nuclear being an option has been well known, Mr. Speaker. The question of whether it ever goes any further will be a matter for commercial decision. I might remind the Leader of the Opposition that the laws of the Commonwealth and the state, as they now stand, prohibit any nuclear power generation in Australia. We will address that issue in relation to the Commonwealth when we give our detailed response to the Swatowski report. But let me just say again to the Leader of the Opposition, if you are serious about climate change, if you want to lead the intellectual debate on this issue, you have to look at every option. You should not bring to the climate change future of Australia or the world a closed mind. You should not bring your ideological prejudices. You should not be overborne by the member for Kingston-Smith on this issue. And my challenge to the Leader of the Opposition is to get out in front of the Australian Labor Party, show a bit of policy courage, show a bit of intellectual depth, and acknowledge that if we're serious, we'll look at cleaning up coal, we'll look at wind and solar power at the margin, because you can't run power stations on wind and solar. You'll examine nuclear power. You'll recognise that the mandatory imposition of a higher MRET target, Mr. Speaker, will do great damage to Australian industry, and that was why we were not prepared to go further when we brought out the Energy White Paper. And it's not right of the Leader of the Opposition to say, I reject MRET targets. I don't. I think they should be measured and not place an unreasonable burden on Australian industry. But, Mr. Speaker, let me return to the central point. If this nation is to have a sensible debate about climate change, we have got to look at the cleanest and greenest power generation source of all, and that is nuclear power.
Order. 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 Members are holding up their own question time. The Honourable Member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Health and Ageing. Is the Minister aware of calls for a single funder model of healthcare organisation in Australia? Is support for such a model growing, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable Minister for Health and Ageing.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do thank the member for Bonner for his question, and I can assure him and the House that the Howard government strongly supports Australia's great Medicare system. Mr Speaker, it's not perfect, but it is at least as good as any health system anywhere in the world. And, Mr Speaker, the principal reason why the Howard government is undeniably the best friend that Medicare has ever had is that many members opposite now want to reform Medicare out of existence. And, Mr Speaker, those that want to reform Medicare out of existence start with none other than the Deputy Leader of the Opposition herself, the former Shadow Minister for Health, the member for Lalor, who has been a consistent supporter of a single funder in place of Australia's existing health programs. As she said to the Tasmanian AMA in May of 2004, the principal characteristic of a unified national health system is that existing Commonwealth health monies, that's to say Medicare, the PBS, aged care funding and health care agreement money, are combined with well, she had a bit of intellectual credibility and honesty, which the current shadow misses lacks. She said, combined with existing state and territory health monies, and the combined pool of money is then applied to the population's health needs. So let's be quite clear. Let's be quite clear. As far as the Deputy Leader of the Opposition is concerned, this is the death of Medicare and its replacement by something resembling the UK National Health Service. But she didn't leave that back in 2004. As recently as her Earl Page lecture last year, she said a Labor government would be prepared to examine the need for big changes. That includes a single funder for health care, and she even managed to con her then leader, the member for Brand, who said in his address to the Economic and Social Outlook Conference in Melbourne last November, shifting to a single public funder for health care is on my reform agenda. So she supports it, the former leader supports it, but wait, Mr Speaker, recently we had the Shadow Minister for Federalism come out and say, and I'm quoting the Age of a week or so back, the member for Fraser, Mr McMullen said the single funding model, where the Commonwealth and states would contribute to a common pool of money, had substantial problems. Well, good on the Shadow Minister for Federalism. That would be a bad idea, he said. So, Mr Speaker, who's right? Is it the Deputy Leader of the Opposition who supports a single funder, or the Shadow Minister for Federalism who opposes it? And I say to the Leader of the Opposition, you can't wimp out of taking sides on this one. You've got to take sides on this one. You can't be all things to everyone on this one, but you know, he's a strange piece of work, this bloke, Mr Speaker. He supports the US alliance, but he doesn't support helping America in Iraq. He says he's against greenhouse gas emissions, but he won't support nuclear.
Order. The Leader resume his seat. The honourable member for Wills on the point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The minister was asked about health funding models. I ask you to draw him back to the question he was asked.
The member for Wills resume his seat. I'm sure the Minister for Health and Ageing will come back to the question. I call the Minister.
Making the point that the Leader of the Opposition should resolve this contradiction like he should resolve so many contradictions. He says he's not a socialist, but he is a Christian socialist. He says he's an Anglican, but he's never quite resigned from the Catholic Church.
Order.
Mr Speaker,
the minister
will the real Kevin Rudd please stand up?
The Minister
not this flaky, Mr Speaker.
Minister resume his seat.
And that's where we'll leave the House of Representatives. You can see a recording of today's Senate question time at 12:30 tonight. And we'll be back at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon with question time from the House of Representatives. Until then, good afternoon from Parliament House in Canberra.
Hey,